Imagine sitting in the comfort of your own home, surrounded by friends, laughing, drinking, thinking nothing could go wrong on it until a stranger steps out of the woods, strips down, and climbs into your hot tub. His wide, lifeless eyes fix on you as he whispers confessions that make your blood run cold. You throw him out, but hours later he returns, standing in the shadows, smiling through your window. What would you do? Or picture yourself deep inside a forgotten sewer tunnel, icy air biting at your skin, your flashlight flickering, graffiti of strange dates scrawled in red, the sound of a rock crashing in the darkness, and then a scream that doesn't belong to anyone you know. You run, but when you finally get home, someone rings your doorbell in the dead of night. And then there are the woods. Twisted shopping carts tied to trees, melted dolls hanging over fire, and footsteps circling your tent as whistling cuts through the silence. These are not ghost stories. These are real encounters. Welcome to The Price Paid. Subscribe now, if you dare. It was the kind of night that feels ordinary at first glance. The kind of Saturday when young people cling to the last moments of freedom before responsibilities return. Mark, a college student living in Indiana, had invited 3 of his closest friends, Kyle, Keenan, and Derek, for one last night of spring break. The 4 of them had known each other for years, and nights like this were a ritual, a chance to laugh too loud, to drink a little too much, and to forget that classes were waiting for them on Monday. The garage smelled faintly of stale beer and chalk dust from the pool table. Music pulsed from a speaker that rattled against the workbench, and the sound of laughter spilled into the quiet neighborhood like nothing could touch them there. By midnight, the night had that electric quality, the sense that time had slowed down, that the world outside the garage did not exist. Kyle suggested they take the fun outside to the hot tub. It was still cold, early spring chill clinging to the air, and the thought of slipping into warm water with drinks in hand sounded perfect. The 4 of them changed into swim trunks, carried beers and plastic cups out to the patio, and sank into the bubbling heat.
We got this.
The woods pressed close behind the house, tall trees swaying gently, their branches creaking in the wind. For a while, it was easy to ignore how those trees looked different at night. Darker, thicker, like they were hiding something just out of sight. At first, it was just laughter, conversation, steam rising in plumes above the tub. But then, faint and sharp, came the sound of sticks breaking. It was subtle enough to dismiss, yet distinct enough that they all froze. It wasn't the irregular shuffle of an animal. It was the rhythm of footsteps, human footsteps. The group looked at one another in silence, as if each was waiting for the other to laugh it off. Keenan tried, forcing a grin and saying it was probably nothing. Maybe a deer, maybe just the wind. But his voice was thin, unconvincing. They turned the music up louder, trying to drown out the unease. 10 minutes passed before their fear proved justified. A figure stepped out from the tree line, breaking through the shadows into the patio light. He was a man, tall and oddly stiff, wearing a long black coat over white sweatpants and, bizarrely, a gaming headset. His eyes were wide, his face blank, as if no emotion remained behind it. The laughter died instantly. Mark's stomach sank. Kyle cursed under his breath. Derek sat forward like he might climb out of the tub at any second. The stranger raised his hand slowly, awkwardly, and said his name was Seth. He claimed he was 33 years old and had heard them laughing, so he thought he would join. The 4 friends exchanged looks, each more unsettled than the last. Mark told him flatly to leave, his voice cutting sharper than he intended. But Seth didn't budge. He removed his coat, then his shoes, then his pants until he was left standing in only his underwear. And then, without hesitation, he stepped into the hot tub with them. The air shifted immediately, heavy and wrong. No one spoke for a moment, because what words could exist for this? Mark's hand trembled as he pulled out his phone and began recording. Not as a joke, but as a way of anchoring himself to reality. He needed proof that this was happening, that he wasn't imagining it. The questions came in stilted bursts. Who are you? Do you know anyone here? Where did you come from? But Seth's responses were strange, circular. He repeated that he had heard them laughing, that he wanted to hang out. And then, with a vacant stare, he said something that made the blood drain from their faces. He claimed he had molested a child. The words cracked the night in half. The 4 friends erupted, yelling, climbing out of the tub, shouting at him to leave. They pulled him out, dripping and silent, but he offered no resistance. He just stood there, steam rising from his body, staring at them with those wide eyes, before slowly turning and walking back into the woods. Inside the house, the group locked the doors, breathing hard, adrenaline shaking through their veins. Some tried to laugh, the kind of laugh people use when fear is too heavy to process. But Mark and Kyle couldn't shake the sense that something wasn't over, that Seth wasn't gone. 15 minutes later, Kyle insisted they should go outside to lock the hot tub cover. Against his better judgment, Mark agreed. With flashlights in hand, they stepped out into the cold. That's when Mark noticed a phone lying on the ground near the tub. He bent to pick it up, and when the screen lit, whatever appeared on the lock screen made him drop it instantly. He never explained exactly what he saw, but his face turned white. They rushed back inside, warning the others. Moments later came the sound of tapping on glass. A window. Mark's stomach twisted. He pulled back the curtain, and there was Seth. Pale face, eyes wide, lips stretched into a smile that looked more like a wound than joy. He didn't move. He didn't speak. He just stood there watching. Mark shouted for Kyle, who grabbed a phone and called the police. Mark himself snatched a baseball bat and stormed to the front door, yelling for Seth to leave, to take his phone and never return. But Seth didn't answer. Instead, he walked slowly around the side of the house, appearing again at the patio window, his hand lifting in a single deliberate wave before he melted back into the woods. The police arrived minutes later, found Seth standing alone in the trees, and arrested him for trespassing. Relief came, but it was thin, because days later, Mark saw something online that hollowed him out all over again. A girl nearby had posted a Snapchat video showing another man different from Seth trying to break into her home at night. One man in the woods was already horrifying, but two, maybe more. The implication was worse than ghosts, worse than monsters. This was human, and humans, as Mark realized, were unpredictable, unexplainable, and far harder to escape. The night was brutally cold, the kind of chill that gnawed at exposed skin and turned every breath into a plume of vapor. Beck, Matthew, and Tyler were restless teenagers, bored of the same suburban routines, hungry for something that would cut through the monotony. They had been talking about the sewer tunnel at the edge of their neighborhood for months, daring each other to go in, but never following through. The tunnel was hidden under a small creek, beside a row of office buildings that stood empty after sundown, their dark windows like dead eyes watching over the lot. That night, with snow clinging to the grass and their nerves running hot, the boys finally decided to do it. They brought sleds, not because they planned to use them, but as props. If anyone caught them sneaking around the property, they could claim they were just out for some harmless winter fun. But as soon as they pulled into the lot, headlights flashed across them, and a police cruiser rolled up. The officer who stepped out had the kind of tired face that suggested he had seen every excuse in the book. He asked what they were doing, and Tyler, quick on his feet, said they were just sledding. The officer studied them for a moment, then told them to leave. Relieved, they drove off, laughing too loudly at how close they had come to being caught. But half an hour later, their curiosity dragged them back. This time they parked behind one of the buildings, hidden from the street. Their laughter had dulled, replaced by a heavier silence. They trekked down the hill toward the creek, their footsteps crunching in the frozen grass. The tunnel loomed before them, a gaping circle of darkness framed in cracked concrete, wide enough to swallow them whole. Even standing at the edge, they could feel the air spilling out of it, colder and denser than the night around them. It smelled faintly of rust and stagnant water. They switched on their flashlights, beams cutting jagged lines into the void. The sound of their voices echoed unnaturally, bouncing back at them like whispers from deeper inside. Still, they stepped forward. The first thing that struck them was how dry the ground was, almost like the tunnel had been abandoned by water itself. The walls were smothered in graffiti, layers upon layers, some of it faded into smears, some crude and obscene, and some disturbingly recent. What drew their attention most was a set of numbers painted in red, 6/19/19. The paint looked fresher than the rest, as though someone had come here recently to leave a message. The date haunted them, hovering in their minds like a countdown. The deeper they went, the colder it became. Their breath hung in front of their faces, drifting like smoke. Ice clung to the walls, slick and glassy, and massive icicles hung from the ceiling like jagged spears ready to break loose. They joked half-heartedly, pretending not to be scared. Tyler muttered that one of those things could impale them if it fell, and the others laughed too quickly, their voices cracking in the emptiness. The light from their flashlights barely pierced the darkness, and it always felt like something was just beyond the beam, watching from the black. Then came the sound. A sharp crack, the heavy thud of something striking stone. All three froze, whipping their lights ahead. The noise hadn't come from them, and it hadn't come from behind. it was deeper in. The silence afterward was unbearable, like the tunnel itself was holding its breath. Panic surged through them, and they bolted, scrambling back toward the entrance. Their feet slipped on patches of ice, their shoulders collided in the narrow space, curses and gasps echoing off the walls as they ran. They spilled out into the night, trembling, gulping down the frozen air as if it might wash the terror out of their lungs. But when Beck patted his pockets, his face drained of color. His phone was gone. Matthew and Tyler begged him to forget it, to just go home. But Beck shook his head. That phone wasn't just a device that held everything: photos, messages, proof of who he was. Against their protests, he gripped his flashlight tighter and marched back toward the tunnel. The second time they entered, the atmosphere was different, heavier. The cold seemed sharper, cutting to the bone, and the silence was no longer empty but charged, like something was waiting. Their flashlights flickered, weak beams that barely reached a few feet ahead. Each step felt wrong, as though they were walking into a place that didn't want them there. They whispered among themselves, voices shaky, and every word seemed to be swallowed immediately. Finally, Beck spotted the faint gleam of his phone on the ground. Relief washed over him, but it lasted only a second, because just then, from somewhere deeper in the black, came a scream. Not the playful kind, not a human shout you could explain away, but something raw and unearthly, echoing off the walls in a way that made the air itself vibrate. It was closer than they wanted to admit, too close to pretend they were alone. They didn't wait to argue. Instinct took over, and they ran again, faster than before, hearts pounding like war drums in their ears. None of them looked back. The tunnel walls blurred as their beams bounced wildly, their lungs burning with every breath. They burst out into the night, threw themselves into the car, and peeled away, tires spitting gravel behind them. The drive back was almost silent. No one dared put the fear into words, because speaking it out loud might make it real. By the time they each returned home, they had almost convinced themselves it was over. But for Beck, the night wasn't finished. Sometime after midnight, long after the house had gone quiet, the doorbell rang. Twice. His father went to answer, muttering about kids pulling pranks at ridiculous hours. But when he opened the door, there was no one there. The yard was empty, the street still, the snow untouched. Beck lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, his heart pounding. Was it just a coincidence? A cruel prank by some neighborhood kid? Or had something from that tunnel followed them home, watching from the shadows, waiting for the right moment to knock? Some questions don't have answers. Sometimes the unknown is worse than the truth. Ryan had always believed the wilderness was a sanctuary. He thought the forest would be the one place where he could shut out the world, disconnect from the endless noise, and find a moment of clarity. So when his temporary construction job sent him far from home, stationed in a remote stretch of countryside, he welcomed the isolation. The winding country roads, the absence of streetlights, the silence that seemed to expand with every mile it, was everything he thought he wanted. Most of his coworkers drowned their free time in alcohol, chasing numbness. Ryan, though, craved something different. He packed his gear one Friday and headed for the woods, ready to lose himself in the kind of solitude only nature could offer. At first, it was exactly what he hoped for. The trailhead was only a few minutes from his accommodation, but within 20 minutes, he was deep in the forest, where the air smelled of pine and damp soil, where the wind carried only the rustle of branches and the occasional call of an owl. He smoked a joint as he walked, letting the tension bleed out of his body, the stress of the job fading behind him. When the sun began to sink, he told himself he would find a clearing, set up camp, and enjoy a night under the stars. That was when he caught the smell. Faint at first, drifting on the breeze, burning wood. He paused, listening, watching, thinking maybe another camper was nearby. Then, just beyond the trees, he saw the flicker of firelight. Curious, maybe a little reckless, Ryan veered off the trail. The closer he got, the stranger it became. Metallic shapes glinted in the glow, unnatural against the backdrop of trees. When he stepped into the clearing, his stomach tightened. Dozens of shopping carts stood there, twisted and mangled, tied to trees with rope, suspended at angles that looked deliberate, ritualistic. Some hung from branches, swaying slightly in the night air, like bodies on gallows. And at the center of it all, directly above a roaring fire, was a grotesque display. A charred, old-fashioned duck ornament dangled from a wire, and sitting in its back was a melted doll, its plastic face warped and blackened, limbs shriveled from the heat. Water bottles and discarded wrappers littered the ground, proof that this wasn't abandoned, that someone had been here recently, even still was. Ryan's first instinct should have been to leave, but instead he raised his phone, snapping photos, needing proof of what he was seeing. His chest ached with unease, his heartbeat thundering in his ears. He tried to rationalize some strange art project, maybe the work of bored teenagers, but the longer he stared at the suspended carts and the melted doll, the harder it was to believe this was anything ordinary. He backed away, slipping silently into the trees. He walked for nearly half an hour before stopping, convinced he had put enough distance between himself and that clearing. Dusk had fully fallen by then, and he hurried to gather wood, pitching his tent near a small rise where the ground was dry. By 9 o'clock, he had built a fire, wrapped a steak and potatoes in foil, and nestled them in the coals. The food filled him with warmth. The weed dulled the edge of his fear, and soon he was cocooned in the glow of firelight, listening to pre-downloaded podcasts about unsolved murders. The irony didn't escape him. He was listening to stories of strange disappearances while alone in the middle of nowhere. Sleep came eventually, but it was fractured. At around 4 in the morning, he woke abruptly, his skin prickling. The fire had died to embers, and the forest was cold and silent. He lay still, listening, trying to understand why he had woken. Then he heard it, whistling. Slow, deliberate, an eerie melody drifting between the trees. His body went rigid, his muscles refusing to obey him. The sound moved closer, winding through the forest like it was circling him. When the whistling stopped, it was worse. Footsteps followed, quick and light, circling his tent. One set, then another. Ryan's breath hitched. He forced himself to move, throwing on his boots, fumbling with the zipper. The footsteps stopped just as he burst out into the night. The forest was still, shadows stretching in every direction, but he knew he wasn't alone. His heart thumped in his throat as he realized the worst possible truth. The sound had come from the direction of the trailhead, the only way back to safety. Whoever they were, they had cut him off. He ran, crashing through brush, dodging branches. The footsteps followed, multiple now, overlapping, chaotic. 2, maybe 3. They didn't shout, they didn't speak, they only pursued, their presence pounding through the dark. Ryan's lungs burned, his legs screamed, but fear kept him moving. After what felt like an eternity, he dove into a dense cluster of trees, pressing himself into the undergrowth, pulling leaves and dirt over his body. He lay there trembling, listening as the footsteps slowed, then faded, swallowed by the night. Minutes dragged into what felt like hours before he dared move again. His body was scraped raw from crawling through roots and thorns, but he didn't care. Every sound made him flinch, the snap of a twig, the hoot of an owl, the distant creak of trees. Eventually, the forest thinned, and through the branches he saw the trailhead. Relief surged through him, and he sprinted the final stretch, not daring to look behind. Back at his temporary accommodation, he called the police immediately, spilling the story in a rush of broken sentences. They promised to investigate, but days passed and nothing came of it. There were no reports, no follow-ups, no answers. Ryan never forgot the sound of that whistling, the overlapping footsteps, the sight of the twisted shrine in the woods. He became convinced it wasn't random. The carts, the doll, the fire, it was a message, maybe a ritual. Whoever they weren't just drifters or pranksters. They were organized, purposeful, and they had almost caught him. He finished his work contract and left that countryside behind, but the memory followed him like a shadow. Even now, years later, he remembers the helplessness of lying hidden in the dirt, hearing strangers search for him in the dark. If there's a lesson buried in that night, it's one he never stops repeating. When something feels wrong, when every instinct in your body screams to leave, listen. Because sometimes, staying 1 second too long is all it takes to pay the ultimate price. Looking back at these 3 stories side by side, a pattern begins to emerge. One that is more terrifying than any ghost tale because it is rooted in reality. Mark and his friends encountered a stranger who stepped out of the woods, stripped down, and joined them in their hot tub as if boundaries didn't exist. Beck, Matthew, and Tyler entered a tunnel, only to be driven out by screams and sounds that seemed to belong to something watching them in the dark. Ryan stumbled onto a bizarre shrine in the forest and was hunted through the trees by unseen pursuers. At first glance, they seemed like separate, isolated incidents. But when you consider the details, the similarities are impossible to ignore. Each story starts with ordinary circumstances. A gathering of friends, a childish dare to explore, a man seeking solitude. These are moments any of us could find ourselves in. Nights that begin harmlessly enough. Yet, within that ordinary frame, something intrudes. Something human but deeply unnatural. A man in a headset, a voice screaming in the blackness, a whistle drifting through the trees. These are not supernatural monsters, but people, or at least things that wear the shape of people, behaving in ways that defy logic. What unites them is intrusion, the sense that safety is an illusion. The hot tub was in Mark's backyard, his personal refuge, a place where no one should appear uninvited. The tunnel was a forgotten space, hidden but still close to the boys' neighborhood, as if danger had been waiting just beneath their feet all along. And the forest was supposed to be Ryan's sanctuary, yet it became a hunting ground where the hunters stayed hidden. Safety is shattered in each story, not by ghosts, but by the revelation that strangers are always closer than we think. There is also the theme of ritual. Seth, the man who joined Mark's group, behaved in ways that seemed rehearsed. His smile, his silence, his sudden wave at the window. It wasn't just trespassing. It felt like he was playing a role, following a script written in his own fractured mind. In the tunnel, the red-painted date stood out like a marker, as if the place had been claimed or prepared by someone else long before the boys arrived. And in the forest, the shopping carts and melted doll were not random trash, but deliberate symbols arranged with care. It is almost as though each story brushes against the edge of something organized, hidden, in plain sight, a network of rituals that we are not meant to understand. Perhaps the most chilling part is how the encounters lingered beyond the moment. Seth was arrested, but then another man appeared in a nearby video, suggesting there might be more than one of him, more than one watching. The boys escaped the tunnel, but Beck's doorbell rang hours later, implying something had followed them home. Ryan reached the safety of his trailhead, but the memory haunted him for years, changing the way he saw the woods forever. In each case, the fear did not end when the event ended. It continued, stretching into the days and nights that followed, a constant reminder that the story was not finished. What if they are connected? It is easy to dismiss each account as coincidence, but the human mind is built to find patterns. A stranger in the woods, a scream in the dark, a ritual site hidden among trees. These could be fragments of something larger, signs of groups or individuals who operate in the shadows, testing the boundaries of the people who stumble across them. Are they cults? Are they lone predators who happen to think the same way? Or are they something in between? A scattered network of people driven by impulses we cannot name. And then there is the question of why. Why walk into someone's backyard and sit silently in a hot tub? Why paint a date deep in a sewer where almost no one would see it? Why build a shrine of metal and plastic in a forest that few people visit? The acts are not practical. They are not even criminal in the usual sense. They are symbolic, theatrical, meant to leave impressions, meant to instill fear. Maybe that is the point. To create fear itself, to feed on the reactions of those who witness them. The thought that unsettles most is not that these encounters happened, but that they could happen anywhere. Seth could step out of any tree line in any small town. A tunnel beneath any neighborhood might hold echoes that should never be heard. Any forest could hide a ritual that someone wants no one to discover. These stories show us that horror is not confined to the supernatural. It lives in the choices of human beings who act outside the rules the rest of us cling to. And perhaps the most important truth is this. All three groups survived because they trusted their instincts. Mark recorded, confronted, and then called the police. Beck and his friends fled when the scream came, even if their curiosity pulled them back once. Ryan ran, hid, and eventually escaped by following his gut, by refusing to stay where every nerve in his body told him not to. Instinct is often dismissed, but it is the body's way of telling us the truth, faster than our minds can process. In the end, these stories are not simply about fear, but about survival. They are reminders that we live alongside people whose motives we will never understand, people who blur the line between eccentric and dangerous. It is not ghosts or demons we must fear most, but the unknown faces in the crowd, the ones who step too close, who linger too long, who appear where they should not. The world will always hold shadows. The question is, what waits inside them? And when the time comes, will you recognize the danger soon enough to escape? When you strip away the details of these three stories, the hot tub in Indiana, the sewer tunnel beneath a neighborhood, the twisted shrine in the woods, you are left with something raw and unsettling. The realization that the scariest monsters are not supernatural, but human. They wear familiar faces, they move silently through our towns and forests, and they appear when we least expect them. That is why these encounters stay with us long after the final moment. Because deep down, we all know that what happened to Mark, to Beck and his friends, to Ryan, could happen to anyone. The common thread is intrusion. Mark thought he was safe in his backyard, yet a stranger slipped into his night as if he belonged there. The boys believed the tunnel was empty, yet something inside made it clear they were not alone. Ryan thought the forest would bring him peace, but instead it became a hunting ground. These places were supposed to be normal, safe, familiar, and that is what makes the terror so effective. It reminds us that danger does not need to knock at the front door. It can already be standing in the shadows, waiting. Another theme is the ritualistic quality of each encounter. Seth's strange behavior, the painted date in the tunnel, the shrine of carts and melted doll, all of these are more than random acts. They are performances, deliberate signals left behind by people who wanted to be seen, who wanted to provoke fear. It raises the question, how many of these groups exist, hiding in plain sight, leaving traces that only the unlucky stumble upon? Are they isolated individuals, or pieces of something larger and more sinister? We may never know, but the thought lingers, and it is enough to make us think twice about every noise we hear in the dark. What we can take from these stories is not just fear, but a lesson in survival. Instinct matters. Mark trusted his gut when he began recording, when he refused to ignore the unease in his chest. Beck and his friends may have gone back once, but when the scream came, they ran without hesitation, and that decision might have saved them. Ryan's body screamed at him to flee, and by listening, by running deeper into the forest instead of freezing, he escaped. These instincts are ancient, hardwired, a warning system we often ignore, but ignoring them can be the difference between walking away and becoming a story that never gets told. So what should we do if we ever find ourselves in a moment like this? First, trust that feeling of dread. It is not paranoia. It is survival. Second, act quickly. Leave, run, call for help. Don't wait to rationalize what you already know is wrong. And finally, remember that safety is not guaranteed just because you are in a familiar place. Vigilance is a tool we all carry, and it may be the only thing that saves us when the shadows begin to move. If these stories have unsettled you, then they have done their job. They are reminders that we live in a world where the line between normal and terrifying is thinner than we like to admit. And if you want to keep exploring that line, to confront the darkest truths hidden in ordinary nights, then you are in the right place. Welcome to The Price Paid. Subscribe now, if you dare.